The talk that I wanted to give tonight partially comes from a course that I give called Aquinas on the Spiritual Life, but it also comes out of some experiences that I had both during my research time for the doctorate and during some time I spent teaching in Togo in West Africa, where I was for a very short period of time. My research consisted of reading very, very closely key parts of Aquinas' text throughout the Summa. I was making my way through the whole Summa and landing at key points and trying to understand what is Aquinas trying to do to transform his students with these texts, with these ideas that he's presenting. After sitting with the text for a couple of months, I began to realize that basically Aquinas was there with me. That in a very real way, not in some metaphorical way, he was present and he was guiding my reading, saying things like, no, that's not quite right, try again, or yes, you've got it. And it sort of took me aback initially when I realized that in fact was the experience I was having. So I brought it up with my spiritual director, who said, well, you better start writing this stuff down, because it sounds like you're having some very contemplative kinds of experiences with this text. And so literally, reading Aquinas became my prayer for almost a year. That's the experience from my research. The experience of teaching in Togo, I was sent to Togo to help set up a center for the holistic treatment of people living with HIV and AIDS. Attached to this center, there was also what was called a cultural center. It's a center that the Jesuits opened for teenagers to supplement their work in high school. And the idea is that the students, as they're trying to prepare for their final exams or as they're trying to understand their course material, will find at the Cultural Center extra classes, a library, some tutoring, so that they begin to develop their skills a little more deeply than they might just with the school system in Togo, which is an excellent school system, by the way, but poverty has made learning very, very difficult. So the students who come to the Cultural Center have to prepare for their national exams. And so the center provides a whole series of review lectures in preparation for the national exams. And since I was there, I was asked whether I might not give a series of talks on Aquinas on the proofs for God's existence. And started giving my presentation, and this is what's going on in the text, and here's how he's working here, and here's what's going on, and this is what that means. And all of a sudden the students began to run with the insights that they were getting from the text and beginning to make connections between what Aquinas was saying about God and their social and cultural condition, so that they were finding in Aquinas ideas and positions or places to stand on that allowed them to critique much of the social discourse and the cultural discourse that they were getting mainly from Western governments about what Africa is really like, where it's supposed to go. They were finding in Aquinas tools for their own social and cultural emancipation. It was amazing, and I'd never seen anything like that in any of my classes at Regis College. Why do I bring up these two moments, these two events? Because they represent for me the basic gift that Aquinas can give us today. The fact that knowing truth and growing in wisdom gives us a freedom and an autonomy that allows us to respond to God's love creatively and with a greater level of personal responsibility. How does he go about doing that? Well, that's the substance of the talk tonight, and that's where I enter into the sort of thing I would do in the classroom. Aquinas in the Secunda Secundae presents the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, as virtues that reside in the basic core faculties or powers that we have. For Aquinas, there are two basic spiritual powers that we have. We can reason and we can will. And faith, hope, and love are virtues, gifts, that are given by grace to reason and to will, so that reason and will can not only be healed, but elevated to communion with God. We won't talk about hope and love this evening, which reside in the will. We'll talk only about faith residing in reason. We find ourselves in the world after the fall of Adam and Eve with reason that is deprived. Our reason is such, as a created gift from God, our reason is such that it ought to be capable of welcoming God's truth, certainly at the level of created truth, so that we ought to be able to discover in creation the signs that God exists and loves us. That's not our experience after the fall of Adam and Eve. With St. Paul, Aquinas recognizes that our reason has been damaged. It has been deprived. It still is capable of great good. It's still capable of all sorts of scientific advancement, all sorts of technological developments, all sorts of goodness, really. You know, as he says, you do give your children good food. You do provide shelter. These things you know are good, and you appreciate them as good. And yet, we realize over and over again in our lives that our reason is impoverished. We don't, in fact, have the experience of creation as transparent to God's glory. We do fall into the trap of manipulating creation to our own ends, manipulating each other to our own ends. Reason has become the slave of our selfish needs, our sensitive appetites. There's a disorder that's been introduced in our very spiritual being. Aquinas sees that reality in spades in his own day. So before I go any further with Aquinas himself, let me take a step back and talk about what was going on in the 12th and 13th centuries that sort of connects with Aquinas' own experience of disordered reason. When he talks about disordered reason, what is he pointing to? We certainly could point to all sorts of things in our own time, but what is he aware of? What is he pointing to? In Western Europe, in the 11th and 12th centuries, and into the 13th, there is a process of incredibly rapid urbanization, partly due to changes in agricultural technique that increase agricultural yield, but also because the church's efforts at promoting peace in Western Europe are in fact becoming successful. There is a settling in that's happened and a prosperity that's developing that makes the city more important. The city means the market. And the market means the place where trade can happen. And the more trade happens, the greater the wealth of the economy in Western Europe. As that wealth develops, it needs the cities even more, and so the cities flourish even more. The cities start attracting because there are jobs there, because there are opportunities to break free of some of the patterns of inheritance that are connected with agriculture. So I might only inherit, a fifth of a piece of land, and it's just not farmable. I can't raise a family on that piece of land. So instead, I go to the city to try to make some money. The explosion of population in the cities leads to a pastoral crisis for the church, a pastoral and a moral crisis for the church. Up until the 12th century, the church's pastoral approach has been learned from the patterns of life in the countryside. And so the church is very good in its liturgy, in its pastoral care, at addressing the problems that are connected with the patterns of life in farming country, in the countryside. We know what to expect, the patterns around how people get married, the patterns around how they relate to money, to land wealth. This is stuff we know. And so we have the pastoral response for that. But in the city, you have large numbers of young people, for example, just to pick something out of thin air, large numbers of young people who are no longer living with their families, so who are not chaperoned as they would be in the country, who have no idea how to relate to each other without the safe haven of families introducing you to each other, the patterns of country life to govern when and how you can see each other. You're cheek by jowl, and there literally isn't culturally any kind of etiquette for men and women relating together outside of the family circle. It leads to all sorts of problems with how people choose to get married, how they choose to relate to each other. There are problems, especially for women, who end up being exploited in the urban context, and the church doesn't know how to respond to that. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, the church's response to these various pastoral crises is basically to say, and this is the first three Lateran councils, the clergy ought to be holier, and people ought to behave, and clergy ought to dress differently. It's a response that is rooted in. It is a genuine attempt to respond. I'm sort of putting it rather simply and bluntly, but it's a response that's rooted in what worked. In a stable rural community, the member of the clergy has a certain status and is recognizable and has time to develop a relationship with people, and that works. But in the city, again, the clergy doesn't know how to be holy for the city. They know how to be holy for the countryside. So simply telling them, you should just be holier and you should dress better, doesn't give them anything to work with. It's a response that's rooted, if you will, it's rooted in willfulness and in the practices of the past. Just change your behavior and everything will be fine. With Lateran IV, something changes. This is 1215. The year 1215 is incredibly important for the history of the Western Church. It's important for three reasons. It's important because all of them tied to the Fourth Lateran Council. It's important because the Fourth Lateran Council is the council that approves the charter for the University of Paris. And so it establishes the first, and there will be many to follow, international faculty of theology. So the University of Paris is no longer a little local school that trains local clergy. It's recognized as the place to go if you want to get sophisticated and helpful theological training. And so students will start flocking to the University of Paris to be trained by the moral theologians there. That's really the reason behind the approval of the charter of the University of Paris. That the moral theologians of the University of Paris had spent time analyzing the crisis and trying to come up with a new strategy. Something that would be not just behave better, but truly a response to the crisis understood at its roots. So they were doing what universities ought to do best, which is try to understand problems in depth. And the Fourth Lateran Council says, that works. That's going to work. Go there. So that's one. The second thing that the Fourth Lateran Council does is it approves the rule of life of the Dominicans. And the Dominicans were something completely new in the life of the church. St. Dominic understood that to respond to the challenge of the Albigensian movement in the south of France, again, it wasn't good enough to just send the army in and send in clergy on horseback to kind of be impressive and to use power and will, again, to change people's minds. You had to come with humility and learning. You had to know the Scriptures, and you had to love the Scriptures so that you preached from that wisdom, from that love and that wisdom, in humility. And it's a strategy that proved incredibly successful, not just in the south of France with the Albigensian movement, but in all parts of the known world at the time. The spirituality of the Dominicans, that my loving contemplation of the text has apostolic consequences. That I read the text not just for my own holiness, but because in learning about the text I can share wisdom with others, was a radical departure, and it's going to profoundly affect Aquinas. And finally, the third thing that the Fourth Lateran Council does is it creates what we now call the obligation of Easter confession. So once a year, you're supposed to go to the sacrament of reconciliation so that you can receive communion at Easter. Why did the Fourth Lateran Council do this? Because they grasped, with the help of the theologians of the university, the moral theologians of the University of Paris, and the help of the Dominicans, they grasped that what was needed was spiritual formation, catechesis, not just telling people behave differently, but helping them understand the truth of their faith more deeply, so that they would be transformed by it. And so the idea was, you get them into the confessional, one-on-one. Confession is this brand new technology of the sacrament of reconciliation. You're no longer doing public penitence, but you're following the practice of the Irish monks, and you're one-on-one. It's like spiritual direction. And the priest is able to help you deal with your particular problems in the concrete, but is also able to help catechize and form you. That's the ideal anyway. The reality is that after the Fourth Lateran Council, basically most places, most dioceses, most seminaries or centers of learning went back to what they knew. They produced already written homilies for clergy to read on Sunday. So the canned homily that we now find on the internet has its long tradition in the life of the church. And they went back to producing manuals of confession. So ready-made answers rather than spiritual formation. It wasn't until Aquinas came along in something like 25 to 30 years later, when he begins to teach at the University of Paris, that someone was capable of taking those three gifts of the Fourth Lateran Council, the analysis of problems in depth, the gift of contemplative reading of the Scriptures and of the tradition, and the call for a new kind of minister of the gospel who could preach the word out of his own wisdom, and hear confessions, again, out of a personal wisdom rather than out of a canned book. He's the first one to bring those three things together and to do something with them. That's what the Summa Theologiae is. It's a manual for the formation of Dominican clergy, but I think in his own mind, eventually as a model for the whole church, a model for how the training of preachers and confessors ought to happen. You ought to have preachers and confessors who have become, in their minds, in their reasons, more like Christ. Preachers and confessors who, by their encounter with the truth, will have become more Christ-like in their thinking and in their wisdom. If Christ is our wisdom, then the way to minister is to think like him more and more. Back to faith and reason in the Summa Theologiae now, with that background. Aquinas believes quite firmly that what faith does is that it heals and elevates reason. He's so convinced of that he says in many places in his work, not just in the Summa Theologiae, that the little old lady in the pew, the one he calls the Vetula, the little old lady in the pew knows more for her own salvation, more that's useful to her own salvation, than any of the philosophers that went before her. She receives as pure gift all of the wisdom that the great philosophers of the ages struggled, and only sometimes partially successfully, to achieve. That's what faith does. It resides in the reason, and it expands the horizon of reason. It overcomes the distortions that were introduced into reason, healing them, and it makes reason capable of receiving truth that is supernatural. So it elevates the reason to communion with God's own truth, God's own wisdom. The trick is to release that. The little old lady in the pew, the Vetula, knows all this, but she doesn't know that she knows it. It is a kind of knowing that is born by her love for God. She just acts correctly because she knows how. She's lived her whole life out of this, and she's just grown into it. But somebody who's going to exercise leadership in the church, who's going to be a preacher and a confessor, has to have conscious control of this gift, has to come to understand it, and has to be able to wield it responsibly. And so Aquinas writes the Summa Theologiae as a set of spiritual exercises, really, in the end. Each article of the Summa is a performance that you're supposed to enact by performing the cognitive acts that it implies. So, I don't know how familiar you are with the Summa Theologiae, but it has a very, very strict form that's consistent right across all of the articles, all of the questions. You begin by having at least 3, sometimes more, objections to the truth that you're trying to understand. So there's a given truth that you're supposed to understand. It's received in faith. It's given to you by the scriptures or by revelation in some way, and you're supposed to come to some understanding and control of it. The first thing that he does is to propose 3 objections to that truth. This can't be so because A, B, C. Then he gives what's called the sed contra, an argument in favor of the truth that you're supposed to understand. After that argument in favor, he then provides his own explanation of the truth that you're to understand, and then he deals with the objections that were given at the beginning. Students today find that very confusing because they lose track of, what's Aquinas' position, and what am I supposed to be doing here? What's going on? I'm not sure. But for a student in the Middle Ages, this would have been very familiar because it's basically the structure of the disputation. One of the things that the medieval university comes to understand is that the courtroom is a great model for the communal search for truth. In the courtroom, you have people whose job it is to explore truth together by taking different positions. The defense attorney and the prosecution. And then you have people in the courtroom whose job it is to sift through the evidence and come to some judgment as to which of the two positions best accounts for the evidence. And then you have a judge who, having received this report from the jury, pronounces. This communal process becomes an incredibly powerful instrument in the hands of the university and in the hands of Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the best at university disputation of his age. For him, it becomes a very powerful pedagogical tool. And so he transfers it into the text of the Summa, knowing that his students, encountering this kind of code, this kind of structure, are actually going to perform in their minds the courtroom drama that he's set before them. They're going to take the first objection and they're going to develop it from their memory and from their imagination. They're going to turn it into the full argument that the prosecution or the defense wants to provide. Because they have trained memories, they are going to be able to undergo that process, or not to undergo, but to perform that process. And they'll go to the second objection, and they'll go to the third objection. And as they're doing this, they're going to reach a point of crisis, personal crisis, because these arguments are pretty convincing. These objections are not straw arguments. You know, these are picked from the best arguments that the tradition can provide against the position. And so you reach this point of crisis, and you're given the sed contra. The sed contra, again, is a one-liner usually, and when we read it, we think, oh, he's just proof texting. He's taking a line of scripture out of context. But what a student with a trained memory would do is immediately retrieve the entire passage from scripture, or retrieve the entire passage from St. Augustine, or from whoever, and again, turn it into this living argument that they perform for themselves. They're left with the contradiction. How shall we sift through the evidence? That's what Aquinas' response does. It's not an abstract answer that just floats above the drama. It's an invitation to return to the evidence. Often, in fact, it's a kind of exegesis of the text from Augustine or the text from Scripture. It directs your attention back to the evidence from the tradition so that you can, step by step, understand the mystery better. And you understand it better for having had to face the best objections and the best argument for. After that, you're led through how do you respond to these objections, because often the objections are not just arguments from the tradition. They're live spiritual options of that day. In the Christology, for example, Aquinas will often present, Arius said. And for him, Arius is not somebody who died hundreds of years before. Arius represents a spiritual option that people of his day are still living as they encounter Christ. There are people out there in his day who think that Christ is this really great guy, really super, but he's not God. And so putting Arius out there in an argument isn't just for the sake of archaeology. It's a pastoral moment. You discover in the reply to the objection how to respond to these people and to respond pastorally, to help their knowing and their learning, to transform their reason according to what faith has given them. So throughout this process, as you travel this itinerary, Aquinas has envisaged that, or has designed really the itinerary in such a way that you take on more and more resemblance in your own personal wisdom to divine wisdom. Your wisdom becomes structured according to the order of divine wisdom, so that you come out the other end and you can take the text of Scripture and create a homily that will be the consoling word that this community needs to hear in its particular struggles, because that's how God would deal with the situation, or how Christ would deal with the situation. You participate more. Similarly, if somebody comes to you for reconciliation, you will find the right idea, the right insight, the right way to talk about their spiritual problem, so that their minds will be opened up and they won't get caught up in the superficial oppositions, but they will have the help they need to diagnose the deeper problem and deal with that, rather than just the superficial conflict at the surface. What Aquinas is doing in the Summa Theologiae is basically working out what he believes about the relationship between faith and reason. That a reason that has been empowered by faith is capable of seeing more deeply into the social and cultural situation and into the lives of persons. And not only is that reason able to see more deeply, but it is able to respond with just the right kind of truth to address the situation, and the right way of presenting that truth or that wisdom to address the situation. I want to close basically by proposing what I hope will be, in fact, a controversial statement that will lead us into our questions for reflection. I've come to believe in my teaching, in my preaching, in the work that I do with the Jesuit Forum for Social Faith and Justice, that more and more our society and our culture in North America and Canada is becoming incapable of the act of public reasoning. We don't know how to use reason in public life. And so we fall back on willfulness. We fall back on willful manipulation of others. We fall back on powerful images that get at the sensitive dimension of our being, people's desires, people's guts. But really, we don't try to promote how those images could in fact empower reason. We don't use images that empower reason. We use images that shut down the exercise of reason. And I believe more and more that it's going to be the mission of the Catholic Church in North American society to open up again public discourse that is reasonable. I believe we have a treasure in someone like an Aquinas, but in our tradition at large, for empowering public reason. First by our own behavior, but then also by empowering others to do the same. And that's going to require that we learn from Aquinas how to really explore the mysteries of our faith, but also how the mysteries of our faith have something to say about our social and cultural situation, and allow our own reasons to be transformed by that exploration. We don't have to do it with the Summa. I think my students discover much to their amazement that when they travel the Summa, they do learn an awful lot that's useful for today, but we don't have to do it with them. We do have to believe that the gift of faith heals, elevates, and heals and elevates our reason, and sends our reason out on mission in the world to be more and more like the wisdom that Christ is, so that we can be instruments of reconciliation